the last thing she said to him before she stopped, was about the garden. It was not an important thing. It was the kind of small, ordinary observation that a person makes to a spouse over breakfast, without expectation of ceremony. That the climbing rose along the south wall had begun to come back after the frost, that the groundskeeper ought to be told before he cut it back, assuming it was dead. She had said it to the top of his head, because his head was angled toward the correspondence beside his plate, and his hand was moving across a page, and the particular quality of his attention in that moment was the attention of a man who is present in body and absent in every way that registers. She had finished the sentence. She had waited the appropriate beat. He had said nothing. Not a dismissal, not a deflection, not even the brief sound a person makes to signal that words have landed somewhere in them, however lightly. Nothing. She had looked at him for a moment, at the top of his head and his moving hand, and the complete and apparently effortless removal of himself from the room they were both sitting in, and she had reached for her tea, and she had made a decision so quiet that it produced no sound at all. She would finish her breakfast. She would go about her morning. And she would not, in any way that could be named or proved or pointed to, speak to him again unless he spoke to her first. It was not an ultimatum. She had not constructed it as one. It was simply the conclusion of a long and private arithmetic, the last line of a sum she had been working through for 2 years, and the answer, when she finally wrote it down, was this. She had been speaking into a room that was not listening, and the kindest thing she could do for what remained of her own dignity was to stop. What she had not anticipated, what she had not allowed herself to anticipate, because hope of that kind had proven expensive, was what the silence would do to him. That answer is coming. But first, you need to understand what it cost her to have kept speaking for as long as she did. Subscribe to this channel now and turn on the bell, because this story does not move gently, and every part of it matters. Stay with it from the beginning. It is worth that. She had not married him expecting ease. She was too clear-eyed for that, too familiar with the specific architecture of a match like theirs. His name, her family's reduced circumstances, the mutual understanding between two sets of parents that an arrangement of this kind served practical purposes for both sides. She had walked into it without illusion and without resentment. Practical marriages were not failures of love so much as arrangements that left love available as a possibility rather than a requirement. And she had thought, in the reasonable and unhurried way she approached most things, that what they made of the possibility was up to them. She had been willing. That was what she would want understood, if understanding were ever required. She had been willing to try, to extend herself toward him, to make of the practical arrangement something that had warmth in it, not the performed warmth of two people fulfilling obligations, but actual warmth, the kind that comes from genuine attention, from curiosity about another person, from the accumulated small investments of a shared life. She had brought that willingness into the marriage the way she brought everything into it, quietly and without announcement, not because she expected credit for it, but because it was simply who she was. He was not an unkind man. She had understood this early and returned to it often in the months when understanding it was the only thing standing between her and a much bleaker accounting of her situation. He did not raise his voice. He did not diminish her in public or in private with any of the instruments available to a man of his position. He was courteous in the ways that the social world measured courtesy, and he was functional in the ways that a household required functionality, and he was, in all the ways that were visible from the outside, a perfectly adequate husband. What he was present. Not in the room where presence actually lived, in the space between two people where attention and recognition and genuine interest in another person's mind accumulate into something that eventually becomes the foundation of a shared life. That space, in their marriage, had never been built. He came to breakfast and went to his correspondence. He came to dinner and went to his study. He attended the events that required him with the practiced ease of a man who understood his social obligations and fulfilled them, and he moved through every room in his house, including the rooms where she was sitting, with the particular obliviousness of someone who has never had reason to look. His parents had been the same. She had understood that, and had not blamed him for it. Not at first, and not entirely even later. He had been raised in a house where a marriage was a structure, not a conversation, where a wife was a presence that organized the household and accompanied the appropriate occasions and was otherwise understood to be managing herself without requiring management. He had married her with no more conscious intention of neglect than his father had married his mother. The neglect was not a choice, it was an inheritance. That distinction mattered to her. She was honest enough to let it matter. It did not, however, change what the inheritance had cost her. There had been a period, somewhere in the first year, when she had tried with the inventive patience of someone who is not yet ready to give up. She had rearranged her mornings to coincide with his, appearing at the breakfast table at the hour he kept, rather than her own, on the reasonable theory that proximity created opportunity. She had asked him questions about his work, his opinions, the contents of the correspondence that occupied so much of his visible attention, and when his answers were brief, she had followed them with further questions, gently, without the quality of interrogation, simply with the quality of genuine interest. She had left things in his path, not deliberately, but in the way that people who share a life leave traces of themselves in shared spaces. A book she had finished that she thought he might find interesting. A note about something she had heard at a gathering she thought might be relevant to his estate matters. Small offerings of the sort that a life shared between two people generates naturally when both of them are paying attention. He was not paying attention. The book had remained where she placed it for 3 weeks before she removed it without comment. The notes had been received with the brief, courteous nod of a man acknowledging information, and then filed into whatever internal system processed information he had not asked for. The questions had been answered with the minimum sufficient words of someone who has learned, without realizing he has learned it, that conversations are obligations to be completed rather than territories to be explored. She had not given up in a single moment. She had given up in increments, the way warmth leaves a room, not all at once but degree by degree, so gradually that you do not notice the cold until it has been there for some time and the fire has been out longer than you realized. By the end of the first year, she had stopped rearranging her mornings. By the middle of the second, she had stopped asking questions about his work. By the autumn of that year, she had stopped placing things in his path. What remained was the ordinary conversational maintenance of a shared household. Questions about schedules, mentions of engagements, the practical exchange of two people navigating the same house without collision. And then the morning of the garden, and the climbing rose, and the top of his head, and the answer at the bottom of a long sum, and the silence, if you have ever said something into a room that did not hear it, and then said it again, and then a third time in a different way, and then stopped, not from anger, but from the quiet exhaustion of speaking to someone who is not there, then you already know the particular quality of the decision she made that morning. Subscribe to this channel and share this with someone who needs to hear it, because what comes next is not what you are expecting, and it is everything. The silence was not dramatic. That was perhaps the strangest thing about it, from the outside looking in. The house ran as it always had. The meals were served and the engagements attended, and the household managed, with the same quiet competence she had always brought to it. She was present at every occasion that required her presence. She was courteous in the exchanges that courtesy required. She did not perform coldness, did not arrange her face into anything that would have been legible as a statement, did not give him or the household staff any particular evidence that something had changed. What had changed was available only to someone paying close enough attention to notice it, which was the point, because if he had been paying that quality of attention, the change would not have been necessary. She stopped speaking first. She stopped offering. She stopped the small, unrequested additions to their shared space that she had continued. She now realized more from habit than from hope. The mention of something she had read that morning, the brief account of a conversation from an afternoon call, the kind of undemanded sharing that a person offers a spouse not because the information is critical, but because sharing it is itself the point. She had been doing it, she understood now, as an act of faith in a future that had not materialized. She stopped. He did not notice immediately. That was not a surprise. He had not been noticing for 2 years. What she had not anticipated was the specific timeline, the particular shape of the noticing when it finally came, the way it arrived not as a sudden awareness, but as a slow and accumulating unease that began. And this she would learn much later from him, directly, in a conversation she had not yet permitted herself to imagine. With breakfast. He had come downstairs on the 3rd morning after the garden conversation and found her at the table and said something about the week's engagements, the routine exchange that she answered briefly and correctly, and then the silence had settled, and it was the same silence it had always been, and yet something about it had been different, and he had not been able to identify what was different, and that inability had stayed with him through the morning correspondence in a way that morning correspondence did not typically produce. He was a precise man. Imprecision, in his experience, resolved itself if given enough time and attention. He applied time and attention to the unease, and it did not resolve. By the end of the 1st week, he had begun, without acknowledging to himself that he was doing it, to notice what was absent rather than what was present. He noticed it first as a quality of the rooms she had recently left. The morning room after breakfast, the sitting room in the afternoon, the corridor outside the library. The rooms had a particular quality that he could not name and that troubled him with the specific quality of things that resist naming. He was a man who named things. He had systems for managing the unnamed and returning them to the managed. This did not respond to his systems. By the 2nd week, he had understood, with the slow and unpleasant clarity of someone discovering that they have been miscalculating for longer than they believed, that what the rooms lacked was her voice, not the voice itself. She was present. She spoke when spoken to. She said what the occasions required. But the particular quality of her voice in its unrequested form, the observation offered without being asked, the thought completed aloud rather than kept. The sound, he was understanding, of a person who has chosen to share something with you rather than being required to. She had been doing that for 2 years, and he had not heard it. He was hearing its absence now with a clarity that was almost physical, and the clarity was uncomfortable in proportion to how long it had taken him to arrive at it. He stood in the corridor outside the morning room on a Tuesday and understood that he had been living alongside someone whose mind he had never once asked to know, and that the asking had been available to him every morning for 2 years, and that he had not done it, and that she had eventually and with every justification in the world stopped waiting for him to, Lord Harwick noticed before the Duke said anything. That was the order of things. Harwick, who had known the Duke since before the title existed, who had the particular talent of a man who spent most of his life watching carefully and speaking sparingly, arrived for a Tuesday dinner and sat across the table and watched the Duke watch his wife for the duration of the first course, without the Duke appearing to understand that he was doing it. She was speaking to Lord Harwick's wife on the other side of the table, something about the Felton Gardens, animated in the way she was always animated in conversation with people who responded to her, which was what made the specific quality of the Duke's expression so striking to anyone paying attention. He was watching her speak to someone else with the expression of a man who has just discovered that a door he assumed was always available to him has been quietly, competently closed. Harwick said nothing at dinner. He said something afterward, when the women had withdrawn and the brandy had arrived, and the Duke had been silent for long enough that the silence had become its own kind of comment. He said, with the directness that was his only mode, that his wife had observed that the Duchess had a great deal to say when she was in a room that wanted to hear it. The Duke looked at him. Harwick held the look with the steadiness of a man who has decided to say the true thing and is prepared to wait for it to land. He said nothing further. He did not need to. The Duke rode home that evening through a cold that had arrived with November and sat in the library and did not read, and the fire crackled beside him, and the house settled into its evening quiet. And from somewhere in the east wing he could hear, faintly, the sound of her moving through her sitting room. And the sound was there, and then it was not, and the not was very loud. He knocked on the door of her sitting room at 9:30, which was not a thing he had ever done. She answered it with the composed expression she brought to everything, and waited. He said he wanted to speak with her if she was willing. She said she was. He came in and sat down in the chair that was not her chair, the one near the fireplace that was used for guests on the occasions she received them here, and she sat in her chair and looked at him with the patient and entirely neutral attention of a woman who has been waiting for something for a long time and has learned not to arrange her face around what she is waiting for. He told her he had noticed she had been quieter. She looked at him for a moment and said she had not been quieter. She had simply been speaking less into spaces that did not hear her, and the distinction, she said, felt important to her. He received this without deflection, which she noted, because deflection was his first instrument in uncomfortable conversations, had been for as long as she had known him. He asked when she had decided that. She said it was not a decision she had made so much as a conclusion she had reached, and that the conclusion had been available to be reached for some time, and that she had been slower to reach it than the evidence warranted, which was her own failure as much as anything. He said it was not a failure. She said she was not looking for reassurance on the point. She was looking, if he was genuinely interested in the conversation, for something more useful than reassurance. He asked what would be more useful. She looked at the fire for a moment, and then looked at him with the clear, undeflected gaze that she brought to things that deserved precision. She said she wanted to know whether the distance of the last 2 years had been deliberate, had been a choice made consciously to keep her at a remove, or whether it had been what it had appeared to be from the inside, which was the absence of any real awareness that she was there to be distant from. The question sat in the room. He was quiet for a long moment. Not the quiet of a man constructing a careful answer, which was his typical quiet, the quiet of a man sitting inside a question that has located something real in him and that he is not going to be able to manage around. He said it had not been deliberate. He said that was not an excuse, and that he understood it was not a comfort, and that the understanding had arrived considerably later than it should have. He said he had been living in a house with someone for 2 years and had apparently failed, at a level that embarrassed him when he was honest about it, to understand that living in a house with someone was not the same thing as being present for them. She looked at him. He said her name. Not her title, not the address that the morning conversation required. Her name and the saying of it had the quality of something that had been withheld for a long time and was being returned. She did not soften immediately. She was not going to, and he did not ask her to. What she did was remain in the room, which was not nothing, and which he understood was everything that was available at this stage of something that had no roadmap, because nothing they were now attempting had ever been built between them before. She said she was willing to have the conversation. She said that willing did not mean resolved, and that she needed him to understand that the willingness was conditional and its conditions were straightforward. She would not speak into rooms that did not hear her. She would not return to the performance of a shared life that was shared in name only. If there was something genuine to be built, she was capable of building it, but the building required 2 people, and she had been the only person on the site for 2 years, and she was not interested in resuming that arrangement. He said he understood. She said she hoped he did. There was something in his expression that she filed carefully. Not hope, because hope was a currency she was managing with great care now, but the thing adjacent to it, the thing that exists in a person when they have finally understood what they have to lose and found that the understanding has genuinely moved them rather than simply inconvenienced them. She had not seen that in him before. In him, she was not going to decide what it meant until she had more evidence. But she noted it. In the precise and careful way she noted everything, and she did not dismiss it. The weeks that followed were not a transformation. Transformation, she had always believed, was a word that stories used because the alternative, the slow, incremental, frequently backsliding process of a person actually changing, was harder to narrate and less satisfying to promise. What happened was more honest than transformation. He came to breakfast and he put down the correspondence. Not every morning. Some mornings the correspondence was there, and his attention was on it, and the old distance settled briefly back into the room like cold air through a gap in the window. But the mornings when he put it down were different from any morning she had experienced in 2 years, because on those mornings he looked at her and asked things, small things, what she was reading, what she had thought of the Harwick dinner, whether the climbing rose on the south wall had in fact survived the frost as she had predicted. He had remembered. She had not expected him to have remembered. She answered him on those mornings with the careful, measured warmth of someone who is extending something precious to a person who has not yet fully demonstrated they will not put it down again. She answered him. She spoke first, once, on a Thursday in December, a small, unrequested thing about something she had read that morning that she thought might interest him, and she watched his face when she said it, not for the response to the thing itself, but for the quality of his attention, and what she found was that he was there, present in the particular way she had stopped believing he was capable of being. She filed it. She did not announce it. She continued with her Thursday. But she filed it in the place where she kept evidence, and the evidence was accumulating slowly toward a conclusion that was different from the one she had reached on the morning of the climbing rose, and she was allowing it to accumulate at its own pace, because patience was something she had always had, and she was using it now for something that felt, for the first time in a long time, worth being patient for. There was a morning in February when she was at her desk writing a letter, and he came to the door of her sitting room and knocked, and she said, "Come in," and he came in and stood there for a moment, and then sat in the guest chair as he had sat on the night of the real conversation, and he said he wanted to ask her something. She put down her pen. He said he had been thinking about what she had told him, about speaking into rooms that did not hear her, and he said he wanted to know whether he was now a room that heard her. It was not an elegant question. It had the quality of something said before the polished version was ready, which was itself, she thought, evidence of a kind. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said that she thought he was becoming one. She said that becoming was different from being, and that she was interested in the becoming, and that the interest was real, which was something she had not expected to be able to say to him, and had now said, and the room held it, warm and still and early morning grey, without requiring her to say anything further. He nodded once. He did not perform gratitude or relief. He simply received it with the quiet of a man who is learning, slowly and imperfectly, to be present for the things that are offered to him, rather than assuming they will always be available. She picked up her pen. He remained in the chair for a while, not speaking, simply there, and she wrote her letter, and the silence between them was the kind that does not ask anything of anyone, the kind that exists between two people who have finally, conditionally, begun to occupy the same room. She had spoken into empty space for 2 years and then stopped, and the stopping had done what 2 years of speaking had not managed. Not because silence was the answer, it was never the answer, but because it had made legible what the speaking had been. He had needed to hear the shape of what he was not receiving before he could understand what he had been failing to give, and she had needed to stop not to punish him, but to protect what remained of herself from further erosion. What they were building now was not a recovery of what they had never had. It was the first attempt at the real thing, undertaken late, on honest ground, without the comfortable pretense that 2 years of distance were something other than what they were. It was, in other words, a beginning, and a beginning, even a belated one, was everything that a beginning always is. If this story stayed with you, leave a like. It costs nothing, and it tells this channel that quiet stories deserve to be heard. Subscribe and turn on the bell so the next one finds you from the start, because they are always built to be experienced whole. And if you know someone who has been speaking into rooms that do not hear them, share this with them today. Not because it will fix anything, because it will tell them that someone else understands exactly what that costs.